very great. Well, welcome everyone. I'd like to just recap very briefly what we discussed last week and the kind of organization from last week. We began talking about the contributions of kind of European art and the European tradition. And I described that kind of haunting backdrop because there's a double-edged sword when you're talking about the European avant-garde and its relation to Black imaginations and Black abstraction from in terms of what those origins are. And it's a double-edged sword because at one level, I feel it's important to bring that conversation to the foundation of Black abstraction, because there are certainly contributions, but there's also problematics as well. So the contributions are that many Black abstract artists who do abstract expressionism studied in those European schools and learned from some of those traditions. And the foundation of that work does provide us with a kind of vocabulary and categories out of which we can understand abstraction. The problematics of it, especially dealing with Black aesthetics, Black abstraction, culture, and art at any level, is to understand that Europe, if we start from a European perspective, that's not singularly the only contribution to the shapes and forms and formal elements of abstraction. Last week, we brought in traditional African art and Native American art, because as many of us know, that Indigenous people had been dealing with abstract forms and patterns and aesthetics long before World War II and the avant-garde. And that oral cultures all over the world, it's part of our DNA, what Carl Jung calls, it's an archetypal element of what it means to be a human, and that is to create, and to create through shape and form and geometries. So it was important to understand that, no, that's not the singular contribution. It's not the singular reference. And especially in terms of Black abstract art and Black imaginations, it's rooted in African traditions, African oral traditions, African early traditions. And even Picasso himself and Matisse and many others say that much of what we do in terms of abstraction, particularly starting with the Cubist movement, comes out of these early cultures. So I just wanted to clarify that point. So let's move to the next slide. And yes. So what I'd like to do is we had to end early because I went on a little bit long, but I want to bring in those slides that we missed last week. And we had gotten to the point where we were talking about art from the civil rights and the Black Power movement, because that served as a kind of turning point. It certainly isn't the very first evidence of Black abstraction, but it's that point where I thought would be a very good beginning point, because it was at that time that was absolutely tumultuous and was able to be more popular and more widespread globally, and particularly within the Black diaspora. So many of these artists during this particular time, the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, were under a lot of criticism, because it was felt that this work, this abstract work, did not represent a kind of activism. It didn't represent dissent or protest. That was one problem. The next one was, where is the Black figure? And many of these critiques of Black abstraction we know are still very prevalent today, yes? So where is the Black figure? The absence of the Black figure is for some very, very problematic because this Black figure is already disappeared in the global, particularly the US American consciousness. And the third overwhelming critique is that it's not legible. What do we understand? What does it mean? It's like a visitor at my house when she was looking at my wall of framed art. She said, "What is this? What's going on? What is this supposed to be?" Right? So there's that critique, even today. And the fourth critique is that it caters, Black abstraction caters to white institutions. I even overheard a student in my class say, well, you know, the abstract artists, they don't bring in the Black figure because it's more amenable to white institutions. So those are the four basic critiques that a lot of these artists that were born in the 20s and 30s, but produced their art during the civil rights movement and during the Black Power movement in the 60s and the 70s and maybe even the early 80s, fell prey to even more than now. So next slide. So let's talk about, I want to some of those critiques. First of all, it's not true that we know that many times just the mere fact that you're doing this kind of work that takes on this kind of form, these kind of techniques, that in itself shows a kind of freedom, shows a kind of contestation of forms that most people understand as art. So even to delve into abstraction, I know someone very close to me who's an abstract artist that is constantly feels like, do I need to justify this? But no, you don't. This person is going on with the form and the techniques and the aesthetics through abstraction. But it's not an easy road for a lot of folks. The second one is that in the very content of abstraction, in these formal elements, there is contestation that is going on. And it's not always so easily for abstract artists to have doors open to them in these institutions, because many of these institutions come up with this word that I think it's Lovelace. She says, they will bring up the notion of value. What is the value of this work? So I want to show how the battles that these abstract artists have to contend with, what that looks like through the actual artwork. So here we have Elma Thomas, born in 1891. And we talked last week about color. And if color has a voice, if we can think about color as music, Alma Thomas would say, red is my protagonist. In the circular piece there, she was very much enamored in the early 60s by the notion of the space race. So a lot of her work was looking at the cosmic, the outer space. She imagined cosmologies as well as represented them through colors. Let's go on to the next one, the next slide. All right, this is another Elma Thomas piece. And in keeping with this idea of, I was still on Elma Thomas, so we can go back to that. Thank you. This idea of red as a subject in and of itself. We talked about the color field. What does it mean when color has its own uh, symbolic and metaphorical meaning? And when the colors are moving, and when you take shapes inherited from traditional African art. And here she's playing with the notion of light and color and movement. Now we may go on to the next one. Okay, so, all right. So in this one, by Norman Lewis, a lot of folks who are involved in abstract art will say, why is there such a problem with abstraction when it comes to our work? But there isn't a critique of music. Does jazz, particularly free jazz, succumb to this kind of criticism that we endure, in a sense, with our own work, with our own abstract work? Here, these two Norman Lewis pieces are inspired by music. Duke Ellington. The second one was actually named after a Duke Ellington piece called Magenta. And he's tracing what Lewis, when he describes this work, he's tracing the rhythm, the sound, the stopping points, the breaking points in the music with his pen. All right. So what is important here is for Alma, for her work, for the work that she does around cosmology, for Norman Lewis, and even for Jack Whitten, it's the placement of the color, it's the placement of the mark, and how that registers as beautiful, how it registers as notes on a page. How does it make you feel? How do you enter in on it? What kind of symbolic or metaphorical encounter do you have with that around the Black experience, around Black imaginations and experiences? Next slide, please. I think there is a bit of a time differentiate. Okay, so here we have Jack Whitten. And what I like about this piece so much is that he said that these very, very tiny cutouts are the grid that propels his work. It's the grid that he hears and inherits from his ancestors who use the grid to explore and explain their environment, the ways in which beauty occurs and repeats, just like the day into night, the months, how we get up in the mornings, and just the repetitive nature of what it means to live naturally and with others. And so that's how he's explaining the grid. And also that this is dedicated to his mother and father. And for him, these pieces represent skin. And he's talking about skin as the kind of DNA along with the grid of everything that matters. He talks about his paint as skin. He talks about his skin as an embodied, contested identity in the US. And so this he feels is a representation of his parents, the embodiment, the physical skin of his parents, his mother being lighter than his father, and what that means. He also talks about skin as a catalyst for his paint as skin. And he also wants us to see this in terms of the labor involved in it. To the right, it's called labor, the coal miner. And to the left, it's the seamstress. His mother was a seamstress. Okay, we may go on to the next one, to number 7. Okay, this one, when the concern around politics and protest and dissent is a painting by Jack Whitten called Boschville. And it is dedicated to an artist who was very much concerned with what it means to live in a world of war and death and tragedy. And this painting for him becomes a kind of metaphor for that. Because at the time, he was very much concerned about the civil rights movement, anti-racist protest, and the Vietnam War. So for Whitten, this is capped color, the colliding of the colors, the dark up against the light colors, the circle, and what looks like a kind of projection of this red form against over to the left. All right. We can go on to the next one. This is Jack Whitten again. And another way in which you speak back to the critics who say this work doesn't represent protest, doesn't represent Black contestation and resistance. The piece over here to your right, yes, to your right is a tribute to Muhammad Ali. And this symbolizes Muhammad Ali, all the grains in the background, all the multiplicities of shapes and very small colors and sound, but colors and sound and action for Jack Whitten, that Muhammad Ali was breaking through. The center, he felt that that was to symbolize his growth, even as a small child, into this larger figure that was set against all of these worldly ways in which they wanted him to be somebody else and to be displaced. The piece over to your right by Jack Whitten is the triangle. He says that the triangle is the strongest, most powerful geometric figure that exists for him. He says it is the triangle that is really representative of power. And that this piece is dedicated to Malcolm X because it also has resonances with the pyramid. And there are two pyramids here. And if we could see this even, much, much better, and if we could see it in reality, Whitten talks about using his pick to scrape up against the color there, to scrape up against it. And so where that you can see deep down there is red that represents the blood of Malcolm that led to his eventual death. Next. Norman Lewis. This is another protest piece. We have to the left, for him, the Ku Klux Klan up against a Black background, the shadows, resonances, suggestion. Where are they going? Which path do they take? These were the questions that he asked about this piece for the reader to investigate. And the next one, the path is clear. This is the procession. This is the march in step, in unison, in sync, as compared to the one on the left. Okay. Next one, please. Yes, this is another piece by Lewis, and it's another protest piece, if you will. And for Lewis, he describes this as a kind of testament. It's it's a kind of testament to what he calls a leftist politics and critique of capitalism and anti-racist protest. That you see them coming out from a kind of pale blue into a darker blue, where these energies congeal, come together. They come together in a circular pattern. And he's saying that the red and the orange eventually create this kind of heat. And he's talking about the energy and the heat from these movements, from this motion, that will eventually get to that center of freedom and unity, into the center where the blue is seen. And then the next slide, we have Zen Master by Whitney. Yes. Yes. This is a tribute to John Coltrane and free jazz. And he's saying, if you can see each one of those colors as a kind of note, what are those notes doing? How fast? What is the melody? Is there a melody? Is it improvisational? Is each stroke coming at a pace with the other strokes? Can we hear them? Next slide. And the next few slides are a kind of testament to and a kind of way in which we honor sound in painting, and suggesting that color and the movement of the line can represent for us the way how we feel about jazz when we hear it, when we see it, when we see colors looking like they're in movement, juxtaposed together, in contrast with we get together, the lines. Can we appreciate abstraction the way we would appreciate the abstraction in musical notes? Last week we talked about slow looking. I'm concerned about interpreting each painting because one concern we have about when we look at abstraction is to tell you what this means. So I'm only doing this, I'm trying to be careful to do that only when the artists are talking about their own work. This is Mary Lovelace O'Neill. She's one of my favorite painters. You see the line up against the black. What language does that speak to you? Next one, please. William T. Williams. And last week, William T. Williams, in this particular work, which is also part of the Smokehouse Resistance movement, where they were painting these bold colors and pathways on buildings, not necessarily the usual kind of protest murals, but looking at the lines and bold colors, bumping into each other, coalescing with each other in their own paths. He said, this is my expression of contestation. This is my expression of resilience. Okay. We may go on. All right. I believe this is 15, yes. Here, what I'm seeing, which is interesting to me, and we need to go back to that slide, the John Lewis slide, is these sharp lines here. Okay, we'll skip that one. But in that slide, there were the sharp lines. They were these sharp black lines up against the kind of, yes, that one. The sharp lines that were black. And he's very concerned about how these sharp lines up against the white ones act as a kind of screen for the way he's smudging in a kind of impressionistic way these various colors. It's almost like you're looking through a black and white screen, and beyond that, there are all of these colors in this mix. Metaphorically, what are the many meanings that could open up for us? Okay, now we can go on to the next slide. The next slide, please. The next slide is a slide by Ella Natsu, a Ghanaian sculptor. Okay. Yes. And many of you may know of his work. He's described as the bottle top, doing bottle top installations. And most of his work is from found objects that he recycles, or he is able to collect them from recycled sources and place them together. And he uses a lot of copper wire to bring them together. And he's suggesting here that this represents the African weave or the African thread or the African fabric. But only done now in this kind of postmodern way that we recycles for the purpose of making art and giving second life that is use value, and that use value is to remember tradition, but also beauty. Okay, the next slide, please. All right. In the next slide, we have Julie Mahitu. Next slide, please. She's an Ethiopian American painter, and she says, abstract work, my work, cannot be reduced to language. She sees herself situated as a social political change maker. And she says, when I make this work, I'm making this work from a collective self that's constantly, she says, mining liberation. She uses Glissant and Mbembe's notion of, or many critics' notion of the worldwide archive. And she says, when we do abstract work, we're really doing the act and doing the labor of world making. We're creating new worlds here. And she says that what that means is that the abstract maker creates a different kind of space that calls up a radical imaginary. So let's go on to the next one. Next slide, please. And borrowing from Maruti's, Julia Maruti's notion of the radical imaginary, we have, I don't want to mess up this name, Naomi Wanjuki Gankunga, who is a Kenyan artist. And what we see here is Mbati. Mbati is sheet metal. And women's groups in the 1960s in central Kenya, there were a lot of progressive women's groups formed this movement in which they organized to use this mbati to replace their thatch roofs with this material. And she says in her own words, this active social activism elevated the socio-economies of central Kenya. Please go on to the next slide. And you will see the kind of artistry that Ganguka is making from this mbati. And I separated into three graphics here so you can see over to your left how it's stripped in these kind of circles as kind of raw material, and then how she puts it together with the colors in that way. And then its observances in the museum. Yes, let's. The next three artists are Adrian, yes, Elenatsi. We're back with Elenatsi. This is just a further example of the thousands of bottle caps and small metal pieces that he has recycled and put together with this these small copper wires to make this kind of fabric that certainly resonates with early African fabric. and traditional fabric. What's also interesting about Ella Natsui's work is the collective of artisans he brings together to create this work. It's really beautiful. And if you have a chance to look up his work on the internet, you can see it's almost like villages of people coming together, working together, putting this beautiful work, putting this beautiful work together in this way. Okay, next slide, please. The next slide is by Adrienne Devine, and her work, she says, is inspired by pre-colonial African culture and African American tradition. Next slide for her. She says, for me, and then the next slide you'll see that she also uses copper wire. It reminds you of that David Hammons piece with hair, that she also uses copper wire from different ornaments that look like they are also collected from cowrie shells and beads and African jewelry. She says, for me, abstraction is freedom. These are her words. It is the spiritual and cultural foundation of my work. It is African spirituality. Freedom fighters are in community spaces where my ancestors are waiting for me. The work creates ports of access to those places and those places of freedom. Thank you. You can go on to the next one. I think it's interesting, sometimes rather than to tell you what you see, is to listen, if you can, or have an idea of what the artist was thinking and how they were encouraged to make this work and where it comes from within their own imaginations and their own passions. This is Holly Tempo. Holly Tempo actually left the US in 2021. She says she left because the cultural, economic, and political injustices in this country prohibited her to continue to live here. She's now living in Portugal. She says something very interesting. She says we are communicating a way to speak when we do this work. Symbolic, textures, gestures. We are speaking in the language of abstraction. So despite many abstract artists who say, with Julie Mahutu, who said, you know, you can't use words when you're looking at abstract art. You can't use words to describe it. And she's saying it provides a language of its own. And we'll see that later on in Dyson's work, Torkwase Dyson's work. Lines, she says, and this is beautiful. I'm going to put it up on my board. Lines have a very emotional quality. Lines have a very emotional quality. And you can see that the way she's using her lines. The next one, and Holly and Adrienne were in conversation with the next artist, Lisa Diane Wedgeworth, who basically works in grays and blacks and whites. And she said something interesting in a conversation. She said, I've seen people in general walk into a space and move and be gravitated to the representational work because there are things they immediately identify with. Next slide. And pass over abstraction and not think twice about it. It takes too much time, she says, to try and figure it out, what's there, or to spend time with it, or be moved by it. Next slide. She says, this is why I think it is a gift, and you are slowly unwrapping this work. Now we're going to move to a more, those last three artists were Black women in LA. And this was I chose these passages from them because it was based on a conversation that they were having together. So I'm moving to four Chicago artists, which we will begin with Theaster Gates. It's hard to think about the power of what art can do in communities and the generosity of what it means to create something beautiful for others that has material as well as a spiritual, as well as an aspirational use value for them. This is what I believe Theaster Gates is doing. Theaster Gates is described as a social practice installation artist. We know his work from his restoration, how he restores and converts vacant buildings throughout Chicago, his cultural institutions and archival collections that he is building and expanding here and serves as a model across the country. And we know this from his Stony Island Arts Bank to the Chicago Arts and Public Life and the Dorchester Project. What do we see here? What we see here is Theaster Gates' Civil Tapestry. And if you know this work, it's kind of a way that speaks back to an early European painting, but he's using fire hoses. And these are decommissioned fire hoses. And the inspiration for this was the 1963 Birmingham, Alabama protests, where Bull Durham set loose fire hoses on these young people as they protested. Protested at that time, and many of them were hurt. And the power of this water and the violence of this water coming out of the fire hoses to stop these protesters. We've seen this. It's almost a trope that we've seen in early marches where the police come out and spray people with fire hoses. Next slide. So this is what he's doing, is showing this, and it covers usually a huge wall, and taking these hoses and speaking back to that and using it in a way to remind us of how we resist. The next one. Or how art can comment, critique, and resist history in that way. These are actually 4 images, and they represent his tar paintings, his relationship with his father, and the way they work together in using tar as a way to build and mend roofs. And so he is making these paintings. Up to the left, you can see how he's working that tar to give these figurations and these textures, and over to the right, the metal pieces, and down further on the left, up against the red, making these figurations and these lines further to give it texture, and then over to the right, you see a complete painting. And he's saying that this conjures not only the relationship with he and his father, but what it means to labor, especially Black men who were using so much of this material to create their homes and different forms of construction. And he's saying that now it's taking on a sublime importance to him in the way Buddhist temples in the 14th century used roofs. And what does it mean to think about tar and roofs that cover different abodes and different places of worship that are both sacred and quotidian, both sacred and everyday. Okay, next one. This is MacArthur Benyon, another Chicago artist. We saw him in the earlier work from the Civil Rights Movement and Black Power movement. I wanted to bring MacArthur Benyon in here in conversation almost with Theaster Gates, although their projects are not exactly the same, but he is also someone that's very supportive of young abstract artists or abstract artists coming up and finding their way through the various elements and choices, radical choices you can make to make art that's non-figurative. So let's look closer because right now we're on this, I think we're in this territory or in this domain where there is this way in which we're entering language through abstract. Can we talk about it? Can we not talk about it? Does it create its own language? What do we do with language, abstraction, the notion of music, free jazz, what we hear, but paints don't speak? So this is a piece and resonances of traditional art. Remember Jack Whitten said that the grid is everything. The grid is the DNA of art making. We see the grid here. We see grids inside of grids. We see this resonate with traditional African art. Next slide. But what's, I think, brilliant about MacArthur Benyon and his work is we see this, but what's also happening under the surface of this. Next slide, please. Under the surface are words. No, go back. Under the surface of MacArthur Benyon's piece are words. And many of them, in many of his pieces, they are autobiographical. Some of them can be from his telephone book, but the words form often between poetry and narrative that circles around the notion of friendship, family, and art. So I just think it's interesting to think about figures, beauty, symbol, art, surfaces in this way, and know that when you look up close, when you do that slow looking that we talked about last week, that close, slow looking, there's so much to be discovered there. And even with the hand, the black hands that frame the piece. Okay, next one, please. I may be talking a little fast, but we're gonna get Bethany Collins is a Chicago artist. And she is so interesting to know and to witness her work and the way she uses paper and the way she conjures up words and the archive and documentation. This piece is a series of paperworks. What you see there is an exhibit of the Birmingham News. And her process is a kind of performative artistic process where she takes these series of discolored embossed prints, and she takes the covers and she embosses them through this technique where she presses them into kind of a slate gray the slate gray kind of soakings and pressings until they are crumpled in this way. But the writing, and still it kind of speaks out in its texture from what is being said. What is she doing here? The spring of 1963, the Birmingham News, basically, when all the world was talking about what was happening in Birmingham at that time, the Birmingham News ignored it. So this is her way, just like the tapestry hose of Theaster Gates, just like what MacArthur Benyon is doing with the words behind the graphics. You're taking these moments in history and you're reworking them through the symbolic. You're working them to spectators and audiences so they can see what is there and see it differently and see it through the lens and critique of the artist. Next one, please. Okay, Aeneid. So what she's doing with this myth of Aeneid, who, if you would remember, was a Trojan soldier who was the only one that was not captured, and was considered a hero, she's taking the translations. They are also, you see what she does. She takes the translations, she changes the paper and the color, and you see the story there. And she's changing it, and you can only see, go to the next one, I think is right. What she usually does, that's where you can see it up close. So this history of writing book 3 and changing the words and what we value that is written down, she kind of signifies on that. And she says, this is Greek mythology, but there's another mythology here that deals with water and reimagining passages of water that happen when people drown for centuries in this water. What is the transportation of water in the heroic Greek myth? But there are other realities of the transportation through water that are death and destruction and represent one that is not necessarily heroic, but one of injustice. Okay, let's go to the next one. Here is her Star Spangled Banner series, where she takes a version of the, oh boy. Okay, let's go on to the next one. What she's doing here is she's taking a version of the song and she's, in a sense, next to it, reworking it and rewriting it through the clusters of what looks like this light. So in the Glory of Death, Stars and Stripes, you see has a different kind of cluster and a different kind of movement. So besides each painting, she reworks the meaning of the song, the words, so that they look like these special lights here in different configurations that give you the sense of the movement of these words till they eventually disappear. And so she took the meaning and the words of this in the book. Let's go on to the next one and see what happens with the book. So with this, she cut the book up into small pieces. She laser cut them to give a different version. She binded each variation into a single book. And she looks at the various ways that the Star Spangled Banner has been interpreted through the Confederacy, through women's suffrage, to those folks who had a claim in the meaning of these words and reworked it. And that's what she did by cutting up the pieces, refigurating them together, and through the black and the white lights that we saw in another dimension. Let's go to the next one. Here is, it's called The Flag, the Dixie of Our Union. So she is reimagining the song Dixieland. And what she's done here, she's taken the pages of the song and she has reworked the lyrics in one of the frames that you can see. And what you see in terms of the kind of charcoal that's superimposed upon the song, with each at the top, you can see with each page. For her, she's saying that charcoal drawings represent the deployment of police who tear gas the protesters during the protest for George Floyd. . So there are three operations here. There's the original Dixieland song. There's her reworking of the melody of the song. And then there's this superimposed gray mass here on each page representing the tear gas. Okay, let's go on to the next piece. This is called Cast from Home. This is called, what is it called? I'm sorry. I think it's Cast of the Ship. But each one of these represents what could have been a slave ship. And they are from, let's go on to the next one. They are cast from homemade paper mixed with pink granite that was destroyed, because it was a Confederate monument. So a Confederate monument was destroyed to the point where sections of it were powdered down. She mixes powdered down granite with a solution to make this homemade paper, and she used a cast from what looked like a portion of a slave ship. And with each ship, she gave it a number. Understanding that this ship now, the portion of the ship now, is based on a destroyed Confederate monument that this woman has recast here. So what she's doing, I think, in rewriting, contesting, signifying upon what Bowling calls rerouting, rerouting history, in all of these pieces, is to take the very thing and to rework it in such a way that it names its own and shows up as its own destruction. I think this work is incredible. Okay, let's go on to the final one. Bethany Collins is mixed racial, and what she has here are paintings in black and white. And again, she deals a lot with these sparkles, like she did with the Star Spangled Banner piece up against the blue. This is up against the black. And these sparkles that represent the intensity of the questions that have been asked of her. I'm just so politically correct, or do people ever think you're white? And these are the way she's configuring these shapes and these white sparkles against this black background is the intensity out of which she's in interpreting those questions and those very common, almost cliched ways in which people engage mixed racial folks. Next, please. I'm going to give you time to look and do some slow looking at this. Oh, I did want to mention this is chalk on chalkboard. Next one. This is where we can see the chalk on the chalkboard very clearly. And this is, I love this one. I just don't see race in your work. White Noise series. I think of these white spots as almost a way in which they represent your nervous system when you're asked certain questions, or you hear certain words, or certain ways in which people use language on you. If we could think about how many splatterings or how many figurations does that sound like in terms of how that meaning enters my nervous system, enters how I think. How would I paint that? Okay, next one, please. Okay, this is Torkwase Dyson. This begins her 1919 Black Water Project. You can see in this particular piece, I was reading an essay about Dyson's 1919 Black Water Project, and they were saying, the writer was saying, you know, we always say, and Jack Whitten always says, I am not about the narrative. The narrative, in many contemporary abstract artists say, and I understand this, the narrative in many ways is a colonial project. And that what we do is open up the radical imaginary to think about story in multiple ways. The writer was saying this is an abstraction that actually does narrate the 1919 Black Water Project, the 1919 Black Water history. But as it narrates, that next one, please, it does so in all of these textures and colors that are symbols and that are metaphors for that history. What she's really doing here is it's a kind of 100th anniversary of Red Summer, when the young men, were at the beach, and they made a rafter to go out into the water, and it was segregated to only a very particular space out of which they could be in the water. The temperature that day, and they made this rafter themselves. The temperature that day, the time of day, the rafter ended up going into a space that crossed a boundary. The next thing you know, there was a white mob that threw rocks at the boys. One of the young men was killed. Eugene Williams died. And as a result of that, the 1919 race riots. What Dyson is doing here is narrating that. And she sees her narration as looking first and foremost at the ingenuity of how Black people navigate through geographies and create spaces for themselves to move through pathways. In this case, it was the rafter. The young men building this rafter through these troubled waters, going past the demarcations where they were supposed to be. So you can look at this painting to the right, and it's symbolic, it's suggestive of troubled waters, perhaps a rafter, perhaps going out to the edges to the water where there is trouble. And again, the triangle from Whitten, and this idea of it being the strongest geometric figure. Let's go on to the next one. And here she's setting it up as a kind of narrative of that moment. I think this is a case where you look at it, you think about that moment in history. This is what inspired her to do this work. This is how she sees as an artist, as an abstract artist, that story through shapes and textures, lines, and the juxtaposition and composition of each mark. This is a story that she's telling. What's interesting to me when we approach this work is give it time, give it slow looking. How do we see it? Okay, we're good on time. Next one. These are two pieces that she calls Bird and Lava. And thinking about what it means to be one that can move and traverse through the air, through water, through a way in which you cross boundaries, but at the same time, lava, the liquid of lava. And that these two energies, these two forces, when they come together, bird and lava, the capacity of lava, the capacity of bird conjoined together, what does that look like in terms, and what might that suggest in terms of the energies for Black liberation? Okay, let's keep going. These two pieces represent her conceptualization of Black compositional thought again. Pathways, demarcating territories, the allowance and obstruction of space, water. And what does that look like in terms of our Black history, Black imagination, and Black radical possibilities moving through space? Finding your own technologies to move through space, whether it be a rafter, whether it be a ship, whether it even be music, getting us through space. Next one. Yes. So I think she's asking us to think about that. Think about movement, think about space, think about how we make space. And how each space is different, how it may be at one level troubled, how at another level, the degrees of experiences. This is also, she's also an environmental artist. She's also concerned with how the environment shapes the space, how climate shapes the space. And what does that climate have to do with race and racial justice? That's all the things that she's thinking about as she's doing this work. Next one. Okay, this is a piece Dyson did. It's near the California desert. And while she's concerned about notions of space, she's concerned very much about hyper shapes. What are those large shapes? What are those large configurations that have to create a space for us? And that we make this space, and we make this space large. And that the circle, the triangle, the square, in a space that might be out of place, where it might not belong, but we make ourselves and we make our imaginations there. What are the possibilities for that? How do you get to the top? When you enter that, it's almost like a triangle, but instead of the point, it allows you to enter it. But there always has to be a pathway around it. Next one. Next slide, please. Yeah. And this is where we see, I hope you can see that, there are a series of stairs going up to the top. So you start at the bottom, but when you go to the top, you can see the landmass much clearer and much broader, much bigger. Next one, please. This is another piece she created for the St. Louis Place Park. Yeah, St. Louis Place Park. It's another large public statue, and it's in honor of Scott Joplin, who was from St. Louis. This piece she designed next to what they call the Rosebud Cafe, where Joplin most often played the piano there. Next one. We're going to go through these very quickly. What was important was for her to build a public installation, next one, where people could enter, where they could enter and they could think about Joplin's notion of syncopation, and syncopation for her as an abstract artist who deals with shapes and pathways and ecology was to make it circular, because she sees the circularity of material in sync with the musicality of syncopation. Let's go to the next one. Here you can see someone about to enter the space, and what's important also to note here is this is a sonic architectural installation, that the sound of Joplin's piano is coming out of all of these structures. Next one. This is the piece at night. Next one. Sorry. Very sorry. I thought I had this piece with me. That's the, and then the next one. But you can see where people were, they would sit in these, on these boxes, and the music would come from that direction and many directions. So you can see where you could sit there. And she also wanted it to resemble resonances of a piano. This is the last piece. The next one. We'll still have time. I thought these are her latest pieces, and they form a book of her artwork. And with each piece of her artwork, what she wanted to do was write what she's thinking as she's doing this work. Why is she doing this work? What is the purpose of this work? What is going on inside her heart and soul as she is doing this work? And so she started writing poetry. And it's very much what one of the artists, I think it was Holly, said that it's hard for me to think about abstraction, because abstraction, if abstraction is jazz in terms of words, it's poetry. Unless you're Bethany Collins and you use the archive to contest what the history of the and the context of the archive actually is. All right, so for these pieces, one of her poems, and I want to share it with you, we have time. She says, it's called Sing. And this is just to give you an idea of what an abstract artist is thinking as they're painting. The bad ancestors are welcome here, the brutal ones, the unruly ones, the burn it down ones, the beyond ones. This painting is a reception for them, a salute to the unfavorable, a greeting for the intolerable, to ash and dust, to surface and edge. I open space for the forge. I open space for the forbidden. This painting is made of haunted air, of death and quiet eyes. The gaze expels and disavows. This is disobedience. Terrains of power form here. Refusal hails from the sky. A cunning downpour. A new distance arrives. The canvas is now a black hole, where the horizon is blood red, where all lines are for madness, exhausting shape and distance. The expanse is yours. My arms are all pity. These marks are not made for the kind parts of you. They are for your riot. They are composed for your thunder. Yellow is for the breath and the breach. I scrape and pound to flourish. My palms drench in ink. I'm a wild one, ever glimmering touch and open form. This bolt of light is for the disagreeable, for liberated lumens. At every scale, I make space for you. Okay, that is the last slide. So I think we have good enough time for questions. Um, and I'm also really interested, those who did some of the homework from last week or the prompts from last week. What was that like for you to think in terms of slow looking, or to take a painting and repeatedly look at it each day? So I think I'm gonna turn it over to you, Jeff, at this point. I know I
Sure.
rushed through it, so that's why we have this time to.
Very grateful, but you also found time to let us look slowly at a number of the images. So I first want to share some of the questions and comments in the chat. One is
Okay.
if you can share a title or two of books or articles that, like this class, present and discuss some of these artists. I think I'm not speaking just for myself, but about 90% of what you've shown us tonight, I was completely unfamiliar with. And if you have some titles in mind, we could send them out with, well, as an email
I
along
will
with
do
some
that.
other
I,
things to our participants. That
I'd be
would be
happy to do that.
excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you. So comments that we've received, Alicia said, this is incredible. This is such interesting and provoking work. I think this was about Bethany Collins. A technical question about Bethany Collins' work, the white chalk on chalkboard, a blackboard. Is the chalk sealed, or are the pieces intended to be impermanent?
I don't know. I would think it would be sealed, but I will check on that.
Okay, we can answer that also after the session. Many compliments have been received, including just now. Thank you for sharing your experience. I've learned so much. So this is all good. If there are other questions and comments, please put them in the chat. Also, a question that I had just on how abstract art works. It doesn't speak to us like representational art. It seems to bypass our normal way of understanding, like sentences or photographs. And is it intended to bypass the neocortex, the sort of higher part of the brain, and speak directly to our senses? I mean, we naturally struggle with abstract art for it to make sense, because it doesn't explain itself immediately like most representative art.
That's
I don't know
such
if
a
you have
good question. I love that question because I think that's a question on everybody's mind. How do I understand this? What is it telling me? And I really have to go back to jazz and classical music. I mean, I was listening to Chopin and Chopin. I might not be able to pronounce his name. I don't even know I just Googled, I just know I love the sound of that music. And it's interesting to me, and hearing the overlays of the note, just like Killer Mike, and Killer Mike uses words, but they're just take me to a place where that's so unfamiliar to me and upsetting at one level and reaffirming at another level. That's how it helps me to think about art as I think about music. So when we listen to jazz, I'll use that as an example because I'm more familiar with that. And we hear the notes and the sounds coming out of it. And some of it's just free jazz is discordant in terms of its melody. Sometimes where do you find the harmony? Can you decipher the instruments? But we don't worry, most people don't worry about what does this say? What does this look like? How do so I think that there's a relationship there with the notion of do I need to make a story out of this? Does it have to have a narrative? Does it have to remind me of and a lot of abstract work does have a reference, but do I have to have a place where I can be familiar enough to name what it is and say, that might be part of my experience of watching because I've seen it before? Or can it be like a sound mixed with another sound, an entirely another sound that might not coalesce so neatly together, but somehow you're drawn to them? So can these figures and these shapes, through slow looking, taking your time, serve as a kind of symbol for you, a kind of suggestion to you that helps you enter in a certain feeling or attitude or disposition or perhaps memory about them that might be a disposition or an attitude or maybe a memory that was forgotten. But so many artists that I have spoken with said, we really tried to stick with figures, but we couldn't, especially Julie's piece. She said, I really tried to stick with figures, but I couldn't do that. It didn't allow me to feel and say what I needed to say. And it's also like looking at a piece of pottery, all right? The color, the texture of the pottery, the way it's shaped. Does it have to have a story behind it? Does it have to be something that you can recognize that you've seen before, done before? Can it be a configuration, this piece of pottery, that you are simply drawn to? I think what abstract art does for me, and I keep bringing up, this idea of the nervous system. We know that every thought you have, there's a chemical reaction in your body. There's some kind of your neurons connect in some way. Well, it's the same thing with abstract art. Seeing it and taking time with it, we're going to think about something, and that thought might come out just as a sensation. So I think it's very true, Jeff, that it does appeal to our senses, but I also think that there's a cognitive component to it as well. And especially those folks who do a lot of meditation or a lot of listening to music that does not necessarily have a narrative or a melody. It's not dependent on melodies, but on beat, maybe on rhythm, maybe on contrast, maybe on volume, maybe on tone, can find their way to it. But part of it is just going to a piece of entering into a piece of art and just doing the slow look. Even trying to explain it is hard.
No, I think you've explained the difficulty of explaining it really well.
Yeah.
So, and I think I'm going to end up re-listening to what you just said when we have the recording. Letting a few others speak. Mary Lewis writes, thoroughly enjoyed both parts of the class. My chosen painting is Magnetic Fields by Mildred Thompson. I love the dynamism she depicted. Then Carol Boone writes, great presentation, and I have a new respect for abstract art. I love the expression given to the ancestors. And Carol Boone also wrote, it is jazz in motion.
Ah, nice. Nice.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments? We've had a couple of requests to open up the mics. We've had real problems with that in the past, and I'm reluctant to change from our practice of putting our questions and comments in the chat. And so I hope you'll forgive us by sticking to this policy. I think it allows everyone actually to get their questions and opinions out. So any further questions on anyone's part? Okay, I can't see Professor Madison anymore.
Oh, I'm here.
Oh, there you are. Great. Okay. Yeah, if there are, oh, here's a comment from Alicia. This is addressed to everyone. A question to you. During your presentation, you said the narrative is a colonial project. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What
Yeah,
does that
that's so
mean?
interesting. I first heard, I've been hearing it a lot from several abstract artists, but the first time I heard that was from a poet by the name of Dion Brand, who does write a narrative. And let me just say that I think the narrative that is referred to as the colonial project is the narrative that has a clear beginning, a middle, and an end. It has a set structure. Like when we're taught storytelling, we're kind of taught this structure. And I don't want to throw that out altogether because I think it's very useful. But the colonial project of the narratives is where you have this set structure where meanings are clear. There's the good guy and there's the bad guy. There's the antagonist and there's the protagonist. There's a denouement where something starts out as smooth and then there's some conflict and then it rises to a crisis and then it comes down. So the classic way in which stories are made and listened to and structured structured in these almost set ways where there are these dichotomies. You have to have some drama. You have to have a good person or a bad person or the bad guy and the good. And to be locked into that for the poet and for the abstract artist is a difficult one because sometimes the line can go wherever it wants to go in that moment. Sometimes the shape that maybe should be over here doesn't feel like it wants to go there. Maybe you're more concerned not with how it ends because maybe you don't know how your work is going to end. You see. So this idea of the colonial project is one where you most often you have to have a figure, and that figure has to be placed with a certain kind of identity, and that there has to be a certain identity of what is good and what is bad. So I think that's what we mean by it's kind of a colonial project. Usually in the colonial project, it was, you know, who's the ruler, who's the ruled, who's the ones that are located with the gifts and should master, and who are the ones that should listen and follow. So I think that's what they mean by the colonial project, to break that up a bit. So how dare I bring European art in here and at the same time say, that's not the origins of abstraction. That's one of the origins of abstraction, but so is sand painting an origin of abstraction. So is traditional African art an origin of, all of those are origins of abstraction. And to just teach the history of abstract art, particular abstract expressionism after World War II, when all those guys came to the US and started, you know, it's just not true. It didn't start there. It started with their ancestors, actually, and their ancestors, and their ancestors before them.
Fascinating. If there are no further questions, and this is your final opportunity to put something in the chat that we can discuss, All I'm seeing now are messages thanking you profusely for this evening's presentation. And we are approaching 7:30. I have a few closing remarks. First of all, thank you, Soini Madison, for leading us on this journey through the extraordinary, not world, but universe of Black abstract artists, many of whom I think were new names for not only me, but many of the others in the room. And also explaining the many different issues that Black abstract artists face and speak to. So we're going to do as we did last week, namely send out some of the questions with comments from Professor Madison, if she has comments, and also, as we discussed earlier, some of the literature that would help us continue to read further what we've begun through this mini course. So looking ahead, it's really a pleasure to announce the third mini course of this academic year with Professor Peter Hayes of the Departments of German and History. These sessions will take place on April 18th and 25th. We're going to get a registration possibility up as soon as possible. His topic will be misconceptions of the Holocaust. He's actually one of the leading historians of the United States and the world on the subject of the Holocaust. So please visit the events page of Evanston Public Library. After a week, we should have that sign up there, and you can sign up for it. There will also be numerous announcements and opportunities to register that you will receive through Evanston Public Library's biweekly newsletter. With that, I'm going to close this evening's event.
Jeff, I just want to say one thing is 7:29 disclosure, so I won't be persecuted in any way for this. But Kwasi Dyson is my daughter. And I was going to, I have to say that, you know, so for full disclosure.
It's extraordinarily interesting because you have therefore both an artist and an interpreter of art in the same family. So that's wonderful. Her art is also on the poster for this event that many of you have seen. So thank you again to you, Professor Madison. Thank you everyone for joining us this session, and actually mostly for both sessions. And we'll look forward to seeing you all again in middle of April. With that, I wish you a good night.
Thank you. Thank you all.